A can-do movie is a movie that just insists on being made. It doesn't care what kind of resources it lacks. It will get finished. And why do I like can-do movies? It's because I've made a couple of them myself.
So I've been waiting for a while to talk about today's movie because it's a real important one to me. It's actually a pretty big deal, more for the director than the movie itself. Even though the movie's great, but Frank Hennenlotter directs it. He's probably my favorite director. Not going to say he's the best of all time, not trying to argue with anybody, but he is my favorite of all time. So the movie we're talking about today is Basket Case from 1982, written and directed by Frank Hennenlotter, who also did Brain Damage, Frankenhooker, and Bad Biology, and a couple of other Basket Case movies. And because I'm such a big fan of Frank Hennenlotter, I've decided I'm going to do a Frank Hennenlotter retrospective over the next few weeks. So I've got a little lineup of about 5 movies, starting with Basket Case, that hopefully I'll talk through them all unless I get bored and go do something else. Who knows? But that's my plan. And this movie is starring Kevin Van Hentenryck, a difficult Dutch last name to pronounce there, and he's perfect in Basket Case, and he's not really any good for anything else. I don't even know if he made anything other than Basket Case, but I can tell you, he's the only guy I want to see in this role in Basket Case. Now, the budget on this movie was around $35,000, which makes it such a can-do sweetheart for me, like the amount of effort that had to go into it, like blood, sweat, and tears, guerrilla shots. Nothing was easy, but you had to want to make this movie that, to a lot of people, if you're describing it to them, is going to sound like a really odd movie to spend all of your time, money, and effort in making. But the amount of effort that went in to make this $35,000 movie just fills me with joy. It's an inspiration for anybody who likes to goof around and try to say something to the world. It was shot on 16 millimeters, so it definitely has a distinct look. And in 2017, it was chosen by the Museum of Modern Art for preservation, which is really cool. I didn't know that until I watched the movie this time. Last time I watched it was before 2017, and when I played this transfer that I was watching now, I think it was available on Screenbox. It opens right up with saying this print is the one that was preserved by the Museum of Modern Art. So I got a huge kick out of it, of knowing I'm not alone in seeing the awesomeness of this movie, specifically the thematic excellence of this monster movie. Now, the story's motivation is that there are a couple of conjoined twins, brothers, that want to get revenge against the doctors who separated them. You know, it's that old classic tale, but it's a great setup for a horror movie, body horror, monster movie. You can call it a lot of different things, but it's a great setup. And it also, you know, I mentioned it was shot on 16 millimeter, but beyond that, like the lighting choices, the environment, it really has that East Coast independent movie, East Coast independent horror movie specifically look. Where it is a little bit darker, a little bit rough around the edges. You can see the seams in the product versus the West Coast look, because in the West Coast, they're a little bit closer to Hollywood, so things have more of what I would call a polished look. And to me, the drawback of that polished look is that everything kind of looks the same. It's a little too homogeneous. And you know, gee, I don't mean any offense to any folks from Southern California, but outside of that area, people kind of have this stereotype that in Southern California, it's all about looks and not about substance. And sometimes I feel that way about West Coast movies, but you know, I'm probably not being fair because the biggest exposure I have to those West Coast independent horror movies are the Charles Band projects. And I have to say, just beyond the difference between East Coast and West Coast, and where I live is a whole lot closer to the East Coast, but I really love that gritty 16 millimeter aesthetic. I love 8 millimeter aesthetic, but it's just a little too simple. But that 16 millimeter aesthetic, the stuff you would see in a grindhouse on 42nd Street back in 1979, I just love that. It kind of makes me sad because people just don't generally accept that nowadays. Like if you do it on purpose, they just think that you're bad at editing or you're bad at color correcting. And that's too bad because I would have a lot of fun making videos in that sort of grindhouse aesthetic, the 16 millimeter look, but I guess nobody would watch it. But then again, nobody really watches much of what I do because it's so weird and niche. But I would say that Basket Case is way more Midnight Cowboy than Last House on the Left. And it's also a sexually charged grindhouse revenge horror movie kind of thing that's nothing like I Spit on Your Grave. It really creates its own little way of telling a story that's just not quite been used before this, though perhaps it's maybe been mimicked afterwards. But that just draws me to this. Frank Hennenlotter's first real film. And to start this off, it's boiled down to its essence about a guy from a small town who goes to the big city to try and solve his problems, But instead of his problems getting better, they just end up getting worse. And I think that's a little bit of a statement on the human condition. And you'll hear me throw that term around sometimes when I'm talking about these movies. But a really good movie that connects with people, well, it connects because it addresses the human condition. Even if you yourself haven't experienced it, maybe you know somebody who has, maybe a cousin, maybe a friend, maybe somebody you went out with, maybe somebody you were married to, maybe somebody you're currently married to, who knows? But it speaks to everybody on some way by creating metaphors for the real challenges that we've all kind of run across in our time on this big blue marble they call Earth. And more specifically, it kind of states that no matter where you go, you take your trauma with you. Blue, what do you want? I got my puppy dog in here and she's kind of acting rambunctious. But no matter where you go, your trauma goes with you. You can never escape the problems that are caused by terrible family dynamics. That's always going to be with you. You're always taking that baggage. Sometimes it just happens to be in a wicker basket. Now, one of the brothers is hideously deformed, and the other one lives in a wicker basket. Nah, I'm sorry, it's just like an old joke format. I can never pass up the chance for that. But there is the deformed brother in the wicker basket, and then there's the more normal appearing brother, a guy named Dwayne. And I like Dwayne because he really communicates a little bit of naivete, insecurity. He communicates a lot of things that are perfect for this character. He's just this real thin white guy, maybe even a little pale. And he's got this big, luscious hair, this head full of this like curly, wavy hair that something about it just says 70s. You know, it's 1982 here, but it just says 70s. And the 70s wasn't that far in the rearview mirror at this point. And he really just looks like somebody who is in over their head. And I think he was cast so perfectly, as I said before. Can't imagine anybody else being able to communicate this the way he does. And he's a great actor for what he's asked to do here. And we do find out a little bit late in the movie, either at the end of the second act, beginning of the third act, just kind of depending on how you chop it up. But we find out that the brother in the basket, the deformed little creature, for lack of a better word, that was cut off of his side, well, that creature's name is Belial. And, technically not a creature, it's a human, but it's absolutely portrayed as a creature in this movie. And Belial, I think Belial's like the name of a demon from like a John Milton work, or one of the demons down in the depths of hell, along with Mephistopheles and Beelzebub and stuff like that. But my demonology's not really up to snuff like it should be. Now, the murders that Belial commits, because he is the one who does the murdering, he is the one who does the killing, he is the monster in this monster movie, but all the murders he commits, they tend to have something in common. And that is he tends to cut or tear the victims in half. And Frank Hennenlotter's a clever guy. That's not accidental, that's intentional, because, he and his brother were once one whole and then they got ripped apart. So to get revenge on the people who were responsible, he rips them in half, or he cuts them apart. The first kill is their dad, and their dad gets a big giant like buzzsaw, like cartoonish buzzsaw, like you'd use to cut trees down the middle, right down his middle, splits him into two halves. And nobody really answers the question, like, how did Dwayne and Belial, who were like 12 years old at the time, get a big buzzsaw down in the basement? And if it was already down in the basement, why? And this movie is great at capturing what I call the Skid Row aesthetic. Now, I know technically Skid Row is a part of Los Angeles, I believe, but it's been applied on a wider diaspora just to show like the part of town that's kind of where the down and out people are, the sketchier areas, what Times Square was like in the 70s before Giuliani came on the scene. But it just has, the bad paint on the buildings, the bad signs. You got the sketchy looking people walking around the sidewalk all times of the night, a few neon lights that aren't quite functioning perfectly, sex shops, peep shows, grindhouse theaters, that whole thing. But what I really like are the interiors in this hotel that he's staying at, because it just looks so authentic, so poorly kept. And I think that Hennenlotter really shot this on location in an authentic kind of flop house, because it would be really hard to recreate something that looks so authentic. And it just speaks to me like this is what the people barely hanging on are hanging on to. And along with Dwayne and his brother in this flop house that they find in Times Square to live in, are a lot of other people that were discarded by society, kind of the unwanted, the uncared for, the unneeded, so to speak. There's an alcoholic, there's a sex worker, and interestingly enough, they're elderly, because particularly at this point in time, people were just kind of throwing their elderly away and just letting them fend for themselves. There was a lot of criticism of the way that people from the baby boom were treating their parents way before there was criticism about how they treated their kids. So it's kind of interesting to see this history going through in real time too, and just knowing like what the state of affairs and what the social commentary in 1982 would be. And the doctors that were involved in this childhood separation of Belial from Dwayne, they all have names that I think are chosen for a reason. Hennenlotter has a little fun with the naming. The first doctor is a guy named LaFlanders. And this is way before The Simpsons, way before Ned Flanders, even though The Simpsons did have a treehouse of horror about conjoined twins being separated, one was good, one was evil, featuring Bart, that heavily borrowed from this. But LaFlanders, I think it's chosen because Hennenlotter, I looked it up, did a little bit of research, and it suggested that Hennenlotter might be a Flemish surname, a Flemish family name. And then a little bit more to know about Flemish is it's kind of a variation on Dutch that's spoken in the Flanders region of Belgium. So Belgium's this interesting country that has two distinct parts to it. There's Flanders, which is where Flemish is spoken, and there's Walloon, where French is spoken, and then there's this weird part around Brussels called the Brussels district. We're just going to push that away because I went to Brussels once and didn't particularly have a good time, so I'm not going to mention Brussels any more than that. But what we got are two distinctly different sections that come together to form a whole that is Belgium. And maybe you could think of like Flanders being the Belial and then Walloon being the Dwayne or something like that. And Hennenlotter may be familiar with that history given his name. And boom, he names the guy LaFlanders. I'm not positive about that. That's my speculation, but man, it makes it interesting in my opinion. Those regions are conjoined, if you want to say. Now, the other doctors' names are a little bit easier to figure out the inspiration for them or where they came from in Hennenlotter's mind. One is Dr. Needleman, like Needleman, and then the other is Dr. Cutter. And we get this really well done flashback to when Belial and Dwayne were 12 years old, and we get to see the surgery, and it's a pretty gruesome, sort of visceral feeling surgery that we see. And in that surgery, we see that Needleman is the one who takes the hypodermic needle and injects it into Belial in order to sedate Dwayne and Belial for the surgery. And then Dr. Cutter, she's the one who actually uses the scalpel to cut the two of them apart. And once they get to New York City from Glen Falls, somewhere upstate, real small rural area, once they get to New York City to start exacting their revenge on the doctors, we find out that Dr. Cutter is actually a veterinarian, not even like a human physician. I mean, she's a human, but she takes care of animals. And I think that's a little statement from Hennenlotter on the way that people will treat folks that are disabled or have visible disabilities like animals instead of humans. It even makes me think of the David Lynch Elephant Man movie where the elephant man is screaming at people on the sidewalk or something, "I am not an animal!" Well, neither's Belial, even though honestly, if I saw him passed out on the road, I probably would take him to a vet. He doesn't look all that human. And there's a lot of sexually charged imagery in the kills here in Basket Case. And I think that's sort of a visual representation of sexual frustration, obviously. I mean, I'm not any kind of genius to see that. But Belial doesn't have the necessary equipment to participate in intercourse. I was trying to think of a nice way to say that. But he's lacking the tools to do the job. And of course, that causes him great frustration. You know, it's just, especially he's in his early 20s, the hormones have been going strong. Of course, that's a source of frustration. And then it also starts to explore this movie and the violence and the motivations of the violence and the way that it's carried out. It really explores the effect of involuntary celibacy on a young man. And just as a historical experience, I think that's really cool to see Hennenlotter talking about incels 40 years before we ever used that term incel or really talked about it a whole lot like we did for a period of time on the internet. Once again, I love seeing these little connections and just what I would call the forward sight that Hennenlotter had. Just to put like a fine point on it, there's even one part near the, pretty close to the climax of the movie, or maybe you'd say post-climax in the denouement, where Dwayne shouts at Belial, "Just because you can't doesn't mean I shouldn't." And you see that whole conflict there, and I almost feel like maybe I've been there before where I had a friend who was real good looking and had good luck with the ladies, and I was always striking out, and I would get mad at him because I couldn't meet anybody. I didn't want him to meet somebody at the club or the bar or the sporting event and go off and leave me just all by myself. And they probably said that to me. Just because you can't doesn't mean I shouldn't. But, maybe I don't know if you're supposed to relate to Belial when you watch this movie, but sometimes I do, for better or worse. Make of that what you will. And the final kill is pretty explicit in its sexual imagery. It's very extremely laid out there. And it is also depicted, in my opinion, without question, as SA, that kind of assault. People use the R word when they review this movie. And it very clearly insinuates, I don't even think it insinuates, it just shows Belial trying to go through the motions, trying to go through the motions to do something that he just isn't equipped to do with the corpse of Dwayne's love interest from the movie. So it really, really drives home that horrible treatment of one brother of the other and vice versa, and just the hatred that can brew up within a family. You're trying to help somebody and then they hurt you in the process. I mean, everybody who's loaned their brother $20 has felt that to some degree, right? And then dealing with the human condition and telling a good story, not necessarily just trying to even though Hennenlotter does describe himself as a maker of exploitation cinema, there's a little bit more to this than just exploiting the high concept that's here, because it ends in tragedy rather than horror. It's not like Carrie, where the hand comes up from the grave, or the original Friday the 13th, where Jason jumps up out of the water and gets the person in the boat. This ends in tragedy and mutual destruction of the brothers. Although, knowing what I know now, there are a couple of other basket case movies, so apparently they weren't as mutually destroyed as I thought. But at the time this was made, you left the Grindhouse Theater or the drive-in thinking that these brothers had basically killed themselves, or one another rather. And this movie's been pretty influential, especially this most recent time looking for that sort of thing, trying to see what influence it did have on other filmmakers. First off, there's no question, Charlie Band loves little killer things, puppets, stuff like that. Well, in this movie, Belial's hand comes out of a toilet, and then Belial rises out of a toilet, and that it was totally lifted 100% whole cloth for the movie poster on Ghoulies, and then for the trailer that they ran on television of Ghoulies. They very much featured that ghoulie coming out of the toilet. I'd also say this Substance is kind of addressing the same thing with Demi Moore, and not to spoil too much, it's a fairly recent movie, but some things that happen physically, some body horror that goes down in the final act of that movie. There's a whole lot of basket case in that, if you ask me. And then the movie Together is kind of like basket case in reverse, where people start to congeal together, real life husband and wife in that, Dave Franco and the lady from Community. I apologize, I don't know her name. It's like Bree something. And of course there's many others that are probably out there that I'm not thinking of. I think you could even see a little bit of this family dynamic in The Greasy Strangler, if you're a fan of that movie, which not many people are. Maybe I'll review that sometime. But this film explores a lot of themes, a whole lot for an exploitation movie. That's why I think that the Museum of Modern Art thought this was worthy of preservation, as it goes beyond what you think it's going to be about, particularly the first time you watch it. What you think it is a straightforward movie. But it definitely, obviously, the thing it hits the hardest is themes of codependency. I depend on you, you depend on me, but neither of us are happy with the situation, but we just can't get apart because we keep pulling people back in. I think that this does a better job of exploring that than any other film I maybe have ever seen. And there's a whole lot of them that explore toxic relationships and things like that. But this one that really does start with, they were one body basically. And then when they were separated, they couldn't be separated. And one guy's kind of manipulating the other. I think Belial is kind of manipulating Dwayne, even though Dwayne could go off and have a perfectly normal life without Belial if he just had the courage to do that. Of course, it is a little bit complicated by a one-way telepathic link. Belial can communicate telepathically with Dwayne and knows what Dwayne's up to. So it's kind of like that mind game. You got a lock on somebody's mind. It's more powerful than a lock on their physical being, as it were. I've also saw at least one reviewer, commentator, analyst, call them what you will, say that Belial works as an embodiment of the id, and I can see that. It's also kind of peculiar that Belial can't really do the things that the id inspires someone to do, but he's all obsessed with revenge, with sexual activity, with blood and murder and tooth and claw. That's Belial. And I think, there's something to look at that. Is he an embodiment of the id? Is he the physical version of Dwayne's id, the part of him that he wishes he could keep a lid on, pun intended, with the basket, but sometimes it gets out and ruins things. And there's also the whole idea of rejection based on appearance. That's a pretty old story. Victor Hugo dealt with it in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So you can really look at Belial as a modern day Quasimodo, or not quite modern day, but a 1982 Quasimodo. I think that's a pretty interesting and straightforward interpretation. And then I saw another reviewer say that he felt like this film and the way that Belial and Dwayne's relationship is some kind of commentary on abortion. I guess I could see where they're coming from, but the one thing I don't know is this movie for or against abortion? I couldn't tell you because, maybe the world would be a safer place without those kids. Who knows? Who am I to say? I don't pick a dog in that battle. And it was less than 10 years after Roe v. Wade, so it was probably a pretty hot button topic of conversation, even more so than it was today, So this would have been something that maybe he did want to make a metaphor for. I don't know where Hennenlotter stands on the pro-choice, pro-life balance. You'd have to ask him. But some high points. Obviously I've praised this movie, but the creature design, I love the way that Belial looks. I really do. It is very unsettling, almost a human face with a glob of flesh around it and some deformed hands. It would be pretty easy to make him just full on monstrous globby looking thing, but the way they incorporate the human face with those sharp teeth, it really does make it unsettling. It's like part real, part silly, all mixed together in a way that your brain's just not prepared for. No matter how many times you've seen it, I feel like the first couple times to get close-ups of Belial's face, it's always unsettling. And then the thematic richness. I don't usually talk much about themes when I'm talking about these can-do movies, but obviously here I talked a whole lot about themes and imagery, parallels, those kind of things. And you just don't get that out of most $35,000 horror movies shot on 16 millimeters. So that's a big thumbs up on this movie here, Basket Case. And then the lead actor. I can't pronounce his name very well, Van Henttenrick, but he's so perfect as Dwayne. He really shows that insecurity, the neuroticism. He goes back and forth between loving and hating his brother. And he is the only person I could see ever playing this role to perfection the way he does. I'm sure there are plenty of other people, if I didn't know that this guy had ever been Dwayne, there's probably several other people that could step in and still have a good movie, but it wouldn't be as good as it is with this guy. And I always got to talk about warts. And it's a little hard for me to talk about warts on this because I'm biased. I really like this movie and I just want to say it's great from front to back. There's some part of my imagination that's like, what if Frank Hennenlotter sees this video? I don't want his feelings to be hurt. He's not going to see this video, so I'm just going to be honest. From an objective point of view, the sound mix isn't the best. And he didn't have much budget, probably didn't have access to the greatest sound engineer, the recording equipment that he could get his hands on. It's not like today where everything's digital and a little time and effort can make things look polished. This was a time where you recorded it on set when you're filming on location. Not until you get back into the editing bay do you really necessarily know exactly how it sounds. And I don't even know the technology of sound mixing back then, but some of the conversations are inconsistent in their mix, and then you'll get some other noises that are really loud when there's some you can barely hear. So the sound mix could be better, and I'm pretty sure what I watched was remastered, so the sound mix was probably even more noticeably inconsistent in 1982. Another wart that a lot of people will probably comment on is the stop motion, because there's a couple of scenes. Most of it is just puppetry, it's practical effects. And I guess stop motion's kind of practical too, but there are a few stop motion scenes that just aren't very high quality stop motion. Now I like it. I love it because it really lets me know this is a guy trying his best. This shows me the can do. It makes me think if a movie with that kind of stop motion is such a good movie, maybe some of my flaws when I try to make my little silly films won't keep me from being proud of them. But it looks like it's less than 12 frames per second. It's pretty choppy. The pictures, the lighting's not consistent with the other stuff that's filmed. So it will take you out of it if you're not prepped for it. Fortunately for me, I've been prepped for all kinds of subpar things. And then the supporting actors. And I put actors in quote marks there. I'm sure a lot of them were just volunteers, people who needed to make a few bucks. I would put their acting quality on the level of adult film stars in the 70s. which isn't necessarily a compliment, but they can say their lines without stumbling. They speak loudly, they enunciate well, so they do the job. They're just nowhere near as good as the main character. So the final word on Basket Case is that, it's a widely recognized achievement. It's an underground classic. Uh, and it really speaks to me. It's kind of special to me. So the only choice for this one is 5 out of 5 Ed Woods. And as we continue talking about Frank Hennenlotter, be prepared for a whole lot of 5 Ed Woods and a noisy doggy.